By the term humanism, it is meant for determinate philosophical orientation, which places at the center and the subject of its discussion the human being and its nature. But its significance cannot be circumscribed to a specific historical period. Its origins goes back to the Hellenistic culture, and in particular to the Sophist school, which determined the transition from a naturalistic to a humanist philosophy. The Protagoras expression, homo mensura, fully represents this new approach. As Guido de Ruggiero claims, the human, with its thinking individuality, is the new reality. Such a philosophical revolution is brought to fulfillment by Socrates, who, thanks to his maxim, noti se auton, know yourself, invites us to know our true self. Knowledge becomes the virtue par excellence. It is considered as the prime quality of human beings, the only thing which separates us from the animals and that leads us towards an intelligible world to the divinity. Through this passage, the man starts to humanize himself and to undertake his long journey towards an ideal of perfection. The man, or in this case the human, learns to recognize the virtue and the good and their opposites, vice and evil. Socrates tries to submit the human life under the rule of reason. It slowly takes form what Nietzsche calls the Apollonian spirit, an ordered and differentiated reality where rationality prevails, a tendency to create an ideal and metaphysical order to set against instinct and irrationality. This distinction gives rise to and sets in motion an unavoidable logic of oppositions, where good and evil fight each other and pose a conflict about the recognition of the righteous. Only those who use reason to know themselves are worthy of being called humans. So, gradually, the good becomes the ultimate end towards which our noesis, pure rationality, has to tend. According to Plato, the good corresponds to unity and perfection. It characterizes the human rationality. It represents the primal cause, the truth of all things, both physical and spiritual. So the man begins to pursue the good, and with it, the idea of humanity, which is slowly discovered through the medium of knowledge. But it is right here that the main question arises. How does the search for the truth take form? As Benjamin Jowett claims in his fourth volume of the famous The Dialogues of Plato, 1875, the search for the truth is achieved thanks to what Plato identifies in some of his dialogues, like Parmenides, Philebus, and Sophist, as dialectic of opposites. This dialectic, as Jowett argues, does not only characterize Plato's philosophy, but it will also be taken up and developed by Hegel, to whom Jowett himself will be very critical. According to this logic, the movement which generates knowledge is determined by a continuous contrast between being and non-being. But, despite of this apparent conflict, these two notions are not exclusive among them. They are part of a complete whole, which inevitably contains its negative aspect. Hence, the negative character is a part of the reality itself, which needs to be overcome. It is thus, starting from Plato and the Hellenistic world itself, that the man is no more only identified by his individual element, but is distinguished by his being part of a larger group, which represents him and to which he is represented by. This group is the city-state, the polis. It constitutes a perfect combination between individual and universal. But it is in this early form of political unity that an initial inequality takes shape. Only the citizen of the polis, who has the specific characteristic of the human and consequently can get involved into political life, is considered as a man. Everyone else apart from this unity is identified as uncivilized, a barbarian or savage. He is less than a man and can be used as an object. He is a slave. He becomes part of that system brilliantly described by Hegel with his master-slave dialectic. We are not facing with two distinctive subjects, but with subject and object, where the latter is used by the former as a mean to recognize itself. Fichte's philosophy, in particular his works Grundlagen der gesamten Wissenschaftslehre, 1794, and Bestimmung des Menschen, 1801, highlights the way in which the ego, the Fichtean Ich, affirms itself through a continuous struggle against the surrounding environment. To the ancient Greeks, it was still unknown and slumbering what will be clearly defined many centuries later by the introduction of the notion of consciousness. Many historical ages and events separate the Hellenistic philosophical tradition from the ideas of Fichte or Hegel, such as the rise of the Roman Empire, the spread of Christianity, the Middle Ages, the Protestant Reform, and so forth. But despite that, this idea of humanity and of human being, unveiled by the beginning of Western civilization, is caught in the most perfect way by the German Hegelianism. To create the notion of being, you need an opposition. To establish who I want to become, I need to define anything I do not want to be. It is not important if such contradiction lies outside of me, as Fichte claims, or, following Hegel, is a part of the absolute itself. In every age, in particular after the Christianization of Europe, we can find evidence of such dialectical opposition. Just look at what Christians did when they discovered a new and uncivilized world. During the first Spanish occupation, the native population was originally exterminated and then tried to convert to Christianity. But a particular fact happens in this time. With Christianity, the notion of humanity is expanded to everyone who is willing to receive the word of the Lord. The pagan idea of humanitas now includes some religious characters, like those of misericordia, mercy, and benevolencia, benevolence, which will be sold here to Spinoza's ethics. These non-human features proclaim the equality of all men in the face of God. This event does not change the way by which the human is created. As Erasmus of Rotterdam claimed in his most famous work, Institutio Principis Christiani, 1516, God represents in himself the human, and every man, as caused by the same principle, is good and equal in his eyes. But now, thanks to the message disclosed and disseminated by Christianity, a new concept becomes part of the human category. As Erasmus himself claims 1 year later in his work Querela Pacis, 1517, this is presumably why people commonly denote whatever pertains to mutual benevolence humane, so that the word humanity now does not point to our nature, but to the behavior that is worthy of man. Mutual benevolence and goodwill are now a fundamental aspect of man. Benevolence itself has to inspire peace and harmony. Peace becomes a category of human, because God is love, and man, as his creation, as part of it, and must bring peace and order. War is an animal aspect. It is not a human property, as Erasmus claims, especially if it wages from one Christian against another. Erasmus says, I quote, "Nation rises against nation, and which the heathens would have reproached as unnatural, relatives rise against their nearest kindred, brother against brother, son against father. More atrocious still, a Christian against a man, and worst of all, a Christian against a Christian." Peace is no more just a principle to spread. It represents now a universal value. The Western civilization is responsible for it. It has to spread the divine message of its religion, and with it, to promote peace. But what follows is, in accordance with what has been said, that everyone who is not willing to accept the love of God is also not disposed to accept peace. Consequently, all those who do not recognize this value are simply animals, not men, and above all, not humans. It may be argued that this kind of interpretation is too strictly connected to a Fichtean point of view, by which the creation of human is only possible through a dehumanization of the other. In some respects, Fichte's logic has been a useful mean to interpret and understand the historical period preceding a very important event. To some extent, the decolonization process of the late 20th century revealed the anachronism of such logic. Humanity could no longer be tied to a religious aspect, because, as Feuerbach would say, God is no more than an alienation of humans' characteristics. It is no longer possible to consider others as an object, a mere passive antagonism. As Bert Pollan claims, according to his interpretations of Hegel's dialectic, true humanity might only be achieved in full ethical life, the condition in which recognition obtains in a way that lets each individual be him or herself through the other, rather than in opposition to the other. This quote perfectly reflects the process set in motion by the Hegelian zeitgeist, which paves the way for the realization of the non-being, previously considered as a mere mean to set against. As it can be observed, using the example of the decolonization process, the early considered non-human being is now going to get rid of its negative aspects, namely what had reduced him to a simple benchmark for letting grow the idea of humanity within the Western tradition. Opposition does not represent a conflict between subject and object, but a way to reconcile differences in a comprehensive and systematic way. The opposition is now a way towards self-improvement. Humanity is also within the reach of all. It is the result of a dialectical movement based on the Hegelian idea of inclusiveness. It is precisely on Hegel's assumptions that Fanon based his interpretation of reality. Fanon's analysis of African colonized people is highly affected by the Hegelian dialectic. Hegel's greatest merit, according to Fanon, has been that of shedding light on the intersubjective procedure through our consciousness takes shape, showing how a human is formed by imposing himself on others. But he is also partly critical against Hegel. Although he does not deny the logical evidence of a self-recognition thesis based on dialectical assumptions, he strongly criticizes the practical possibility of its application. In his famous work, Black Skin While White Masks, 1952, Fanon explicitly makes reference to the conditions in which the former North African colonies are, and to their willingness, not only as a nation, to realize themselves. According to Fanon, Hegel presupposes a state of subjectiveness wherein recognition is only granted for the one who does not abandon the fight for it. He lets also assume, still according to Fanon, an initial state of equality between parties. But this condition, Fanon claims, does not take place in the reality. The black man does not own the specific characteristics proper to the slave of the Hegelian master-slave dialectic. As Fanon claims, the former slave wants his humanity to be challenged. He is looking for a fight. He wants a brawl. But too late, the black Frenchman is doomed to hold his tongue and bear his faith. Colonized people cannot regain their humanity lost, or just the humanity they have never had, because of the lack of internal complaint which enables our consciousness to awaken and to fight for its own realization. The contemporary dehumanized individual does not own an initial state of what Hegel calls absolute fear. As he says in the Phenomenology of Spirit, if consciousness fashions the thing without that initial absolute fear, it is only an empty, self-centered attitude for its form, or negativity is not negativity per se, and therefore its formative activity cannot give it a consciousness of itself as essential being. The Hegelian analysis is therefore in clear contradiction with the historical materialism outlined by Fanon, in which the different members of society are forced to act in a pre-established historical context without a practical confirmation of the Hegelian dialectic. What is emphasized by Fanon is not the inconsistency of dialectics, but the difficulty to use it as an instrument to restore the humanity lost. It therefore follows what Fanon claims: not only must the black man be black, he must be black in relation to the white man. The main issue also lays in the impotence of the colonized people, which could be represented by any kind of social minority, to awaken their own consciousness. As long as the Hegelian state of proto-subjectivity is not reached, the non-human is forced to be confined in an existence without subjectiveness, which turns out to be mere survival. It takes part to a universal consciousness, but is not conscious to be part of it. He cannot ontologically realize himself. The possible way out, as Fanon claims, is represented by the only thing that distinguishes humans from non-humans, the category of violence. The dehumanized man returns to an animal state, in which he is characterized by a deprivation of a full rationality and ethic. In fact, a peaceful solution will lead again to the dehumanized to the system which enslaved him. The idea which Fanon inherited from Hegel involves the reappropriation of subjectiveness through the medium of an opposition, which, in materialistic terms, means violence. The dehumanized man affirms himself through the immanence of the action, and only after he can be able to give shape to his consciousness. As Sartre claims, we were men at his expense, but now the dehumanized man becomes man at our, another man, a better one. We find our humanity behind death and despair. He find it house behind his torture and death. The violence, according to Fanon, is the self-consciousness of the colonized subject, because it is the assertion of the colonial subject's will and body together against the colonizer, which can be associated with Hegelian willingness to risk. But such an Hegelian interpretation, as well as that of Fanon, is concerned with a critical aspect, which is innate within the dialectic method itself. The way to humanity seems to be characterized by a dialectic movement, in which thesis and antithesis, tending towards synthesis, contribute to create a universal idea of humanity. A question spontaneously arises. How can the violence be removed if it turns out to be the driving force of mankind itself? Each civilization improves by opposing itself, its new social ego, to the dehumanizing reality of others. A new man is created from the ashes of the old one. On the one hand, violence can be the means to generate something new, but it still remains violence, and also death, despair, and inequality. On the other, instead, peace can lead to social harmony and union, but it sacrifices one of the parties to be subdued by the other's idea of humanity. Humanity, interpreted in its singularity as a systematic whole, seems to be unable to get rid of the category of violence, conflict, and compulsion, which are at the base of dehumanization. The solution prospected by Fanon, using German Hegelism's categories, in particular those of Hegel, perpetuates such system instead of trying to eradicate it. The idea of humanity needs to be fully restored and changed by a multidimensional notion of it. This is certainly an ambitious project, but it seems to be the only way forward, especially after what is happening today in what is considered the world's largest democracy. Thank you for your attention.